This is All India Radio. In the program Spotlight, now we bring you a discussion on details of economic package announced by Finance Minister. The participants are A.K. Bhattacharya, economic analyst, and AIR correspondent Renu Kataria.
In the fourth tranche of economic package today, Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman focused on reforms in 8 sectors. And talking about commercial mining of the coal sector, she mentioned entry norms will be liberalized. How will this impact the coal sector?
The coal sector is a highly regulated sector. There are many restrictions on who can mine coal and for what purpose. You will recall that in March, the Indian Parliament had passed a new piece of legislation that removed the end-use restrictions for commercial mining of coal. Now it is clear from the Finance Minister, Mr. Sitharaman's statement today, that this liberalization in terms of commercial mining is been taken to the next stage, wherein there will be no restriction whatsoever in commercial mining of coal is concerned. In other words, irrespective of whatever may be your status, whether you are a public sector company or a private sector company, a trading company, or even if you are a foreign company, you will be allowed to mine coal without any restrictions. Why I said foreign companies? Because remember that the coal sector, the FDI limit is 100% and it is automatic. So therefore, anybody from abroad can also come, provided they don't come under those 7 land border countries including China. So it's a major signal to liberalizing manufacturing and mining activities in coal.
Finance Minister also spoke about self-reliance of defence production. How do you see this?
If you will recall that the Prime Minister in his address on May 12 had talked about the goals of building a self-reliant India. Today, the Finance Minister clarified that a self-reliant India did not mean looking inwards, or nor does it encourage isolationism. The idea of building a self-reliant India was to rely on the country's own strengths and face up to the competition efficiently and effectively. Now, the defense sector shows 2 faces of this philosophy of self-reliant India. At one level, the imports of weapons and many platforms are being prohibited. In other words, the government wants to encourage domestic manufacture of weapons and platforms for ammunition, etc. In other words, it means that those weapons and platforms will have to be manufactured here, and soon the government will come out with a list of weapons and platforms which cannot be imported. Remember that India is one of the biggest arm importing countries. India's defense imports is one of the biggest. So when Indian government decides on that, it will have an impact on the global arms suppliers. So that is one aspect of the defense sector policy. The other aspect of the defense sector policy is to raise foreign direct investment in defense units, manufacturing weapons, platforms and everything, from 49% to 74%. In other words, what the government of India is encouraging is, instead of imports, those who manufacturing and exporting those weapons and platforms to India will now be encouraged to come and set up their units with a 74% foreign direct investment in India and use local resources, local manpower, and produce those weapons and platforms for Indian defense requirements. So this is the other element of the self-reliant India philosophy being reflected in the defense package. The third element is on the Ordnance Factory Board. India has a large number of Ordnance Factory Board units. There are actually about 41 factories which operate and produce weapons and goods worth almost over 5 lakh crore. At least this was the figure till 2017. This must have gone up by now. So these 41 ordnance factory units will now be corporatized. In other words, right now they work as a government department. Now the government has decided that these will become corporate units. They will function on the principles of efficiency, competitiveness and profit. So this, to my mind, is another way of introducing efficiency and competitiveness in the Ordnance Factory Board units, because if there are 41 units and they become 41 different companies, or the numbers may be reduced, maybe 10 units, so you will see greater degree of inter-se competition to produce weapons and platforms within the country for India's defense requirements.
Talking about corporatization of the Ordnance Factory Board, Mrs. Sitaraman also mentioned that this is not the same as privatization. Can you differentiate these two for us?
Well, it's a very important distinction she made and also asked a very important question. Corporatization does not mean privatization. Privatization is an issue about ownership. In privatization, what happens is that the owners change. In privatization, what is owned by the government of India or any state government, their ownership changes hands and it is owned by a private entity. What is happening in the case of Ordnance Factory Board units, the 41 factories with over 80,000 workers there, they are not being privatized. In other words, the government will continue to be their owners. But what will happen to them is that their structure, these Ordnance Factory Board units, factories, structure will change. Instead of they working as a government department, they will become companies. A key issue would be that when you become a company, do you follow the same principles of financial packages, financial compensation and pension component that the government department enjoys? So these are issues that will get settled over a period of time. Many years ago, the government's telecom department was offering telecom services, and when it was corporatized, you saw the birth of Bharat Sanchar Nigam Limited. Now, something similar is being proposed for the Ordnance Factory Board. So these 41 factories will become 41 companies. So that is what is happening. They are not being privatized, they are being corporatized. Their ownership will continue to be with the government for the time being.
A lot of stress was laid on startups and Make in India projects in all the 8 reforms that we heard today. How do you perceive this as an opportunity for the Indian economy?
If you look at the aviation sector, you will see that the government is giving another push to public-private partnership in the airport sector. 6 new airports are going to be handed over to a new entity which will be a public-private partnership model. Now, India has got almost around 200 airports, out of which there are about 40 which are large airports. Airport Authority of India will hold a minority shareholding of 49% and the remaining 51% will be held by private sector company which will have to bid on the basis of either revenue share or on the fee per passenger. So it all depends how it pans out. Equally important is the decision to privatize distribution companies in the power sector in union territories. Now that will also mean that these power distribution companies, which are right now owned by the government in many of these union territories, will now be handed over to private companies. They will be bid for it. So there are a lot of economic activity these decisions will generate.
Coming to ISRO, the Indian private sector will be a co-traveler in India's space sector journey, as Finance Minister Nirmala Sitaraman mentioned. How will this impact the space sector, especially India's space programs?
Beautiful feature of India's space program is that not only is it highly self-reliant, but it also produces almost everything for its requirement internally. Now, the India Space Research Organization is a wonderful organization that has succeeded in our space programs in a remarkable way with indigenized efforts and very, very little reliance on imports. Now, what is being proposed now is to encourage the Indian private sector to play a greater role in Indian space research programs, specifically ISRO's initiatives. So ISRO will be encouraged to undertake many of its programs, space initiatives in collaboration with the private sector so that the benefits of innovation, development from the private sector can also be enjoyed by ISRO and vice versa. So this is another instance of public-private partnership that instead of the advantages of space activity being limited to the state-owned enterprises like ISRO, probably the advantages will percolate down to the Indian private sector also.
Talking about the social infrastructure projects, she mentioned that it suffers from poor viability. Can you throw some more light on this?
What happens is that the social infrastructure project does not necessarily always have an attractive rate of return on the investments that you make. There is always need for investors to come in, to encourage them to come and play the necessary role in implementing the projects, whether it is a healthcare facility or whether it is an irrigation facility or whether it is an education institution. Now, what happens is that the government wants the private sector to come and play a bigger role, but there is always a gap in the investment that is available and the investment that is needed. What the government now is planning to do is to increase or enhance its investments to meet that gap, and that in technical terms is called the viability gap funding, now which is called the VGF. Now the government is proposing to increase the viability gap funding for social infrastructure projects, and what I understood from the Finance Minister's press conference was that an estimated rupees 8,100 crore is being provided to meet this viability gap funding requirement in the first installment of this scheme.
Finance Minister also spoke about Atmanirbhar Bharat, which is also making India an attractive destination for investments. How do you see this as an opportunity for India?
As the Finance Minister explained, that the idea of a self-reliant India is not looking inwards. So hopefully this will not mean imposition of higher import tariffs, because the moment you impose higher import tariffs, you are likely to make the domestic industry little inefficient because they will be protected by high import tariffs. When the Finance Minister says that a self-reliant India does not mean looking inwards or does not mean India will become an isolationist economy, so these are words of encouragement. And if self-reliant India results in an India where more investment takes place within the country, irrespective of where they come from, and economic activity gets a boost, I would imagine that the goals of self-reliant India will be beneficial and will not have the feared adverse impact of what is otherwise meant by self-reliance.
We're talking so much about the employment opportunities. So as we know that there were these structural reforms that were announced today, how will they lead to more employment opportunities as announced by Mrs. Sitharaman?
Employment is a function of investment and growth. I think the 8 areas that she identified and the many steps that she listed will hopefully lead to greater investment and will therefore give a boost to economic activity and therefore will mean a higher growth over a period of time. Now once higher growth takes place, then it is likely and almost certain that more jobs will be created. She did not mention anything directly about jobs, but with these measures, the real goal is to give a boost to investments and therefore to economic activity, which should give a fillip to growth, and that will create more jobs.
Finance Minister announced restrictions on utilization of Indian airspace, which will be eased so that civil flying becomes more efficient. How will this help the civil aviation sector?
Right now what happens is that the Indian airspace is largely cornered by the defense operations, and the civilian airspace is a narrow corridor, relatively speaking. Now, as she mentioned, that only 60% of the airspace is utilized by the civil aviation sector. Now, the idea is to increase this share, and once the share is increased, what will happen is that more airlines can fly in and fly out, and the more aviation companies, airlines can look forward to exploiting this new opportunity. These are all steps that will be useful only after the COVID-19 impact wears off. It is good that you prepare for the coming days when you need more players in the Indian aviation sector to take advantage of a market which is huge, and with more airspace being freed up, you are likely to see greater efficiencies and less fuel being used, because a lot of these aircraft actually come and fly and circle around airports because they don't get the airspace which has been vacated by many other agencies, like including the defense, for them to land. So therefore, it will mean a lot of efficiency gains and economic advantages will flow in.
How do you see the formation of empowered group of secretaries to fast-track the investment and announcement of ranking of states for investment attractiveness?
This is part of the ease of doing business idea, and this empowered group is already undertaking this exercise, and I think it's a good move. Any decision that is taken must always be monitored, and an empowered group is a good idea to monitor the progress of the implementation of the projects.
Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
You were listening to a discussion on details of economic package announced by Finance Minister. The participants were A.K. Bhattacharya, economic analyst, and AIR correspondent Renu Kataria. This program was produced and presented by the News Services Division of All India Radio. You can listen to it on our mobile app, News on AIR. This program is also available on our website, newsonair.com. You may email your opinion about this program at airnsttalks@gmail.com.